An ordinary fisherman from a small town stumbled upon a strange submarine washed up on the shore. At first, everyone laughed and didn't believe him, but when the authorities opened the hatch, they were frozen in horror. No one could have imagined what was hidden inside. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The sea had always been Malcolm Jenkins' companion, sometimes harsh, sometimes generous, but always constant in its rhythm. He was a man carved out of salt, wind, and the calloused patience of years spent casting nets, hauling ropes, and mending torn lines under the merciless Florida sun. His small fishing boat, patched and weathered like himself, was the lifeline between his modest home and the sleepy coastal town, the vast, endless waters that provided for him. Each morning, long before the town stirred awake, Malcolm was already on the sand, pulling his boat toward the tide, his boots sinking into the wet grit, his shoulders moving with the steady determination of habit. That morning began like so many others, with a pale dawn unfolding over the horizon, washing the world in colors of rose and gray. The cries of gulls overhead followed him as he prepared his nets. The air carried the sharp tang of salt and seaweed, and the water lapped against the shore with the familiar, hypnotic cadence. He had lived by these sounds for so long that silence itself would have felt foreign. Fishing was not wealth, not in his case, but it was survival, and survival was enough. Yet, on this morning, something tugged at his attention before he even pushed off from the shore. He paused, squinting into the distance where the pale light met the darker line of sand farther down the coast. At first, he thought it was driftwood, a large branch perhaps, or the carcass of a small boat tossed back from the sea's cruelty. The ocean was full of wreckage, and not everything that entered its embrace returned whole. But as he stood, his hands resting on the edge of his boat, the shape seemed different. Too smooth, too deliberate, too unnatural. Curiosity warred with caution. Malcolm had learned long ago that strange things washing ashore rarely meant good news. Nets tangled with debris, barrels of spoiled chemicals, sometimes even pieces of wrecks that carried a heavy stench of tragedy. But the sight of that shape, half buried in the sand, commanded him. Something about it was wrong, out of place, and he could not turn away. With a sigh, he pulled his boat higher up the sand to keep it secure from the incoming tide. His boots sank with every step as he began walking toward the distant silhouette, the damp air filling his lungs with every measured breath. The town still slumbered behind him, its small cluster of houses silent except for the occasional barking of a dog. The world felt narrowed to himself, the whisper of the sea, and the dark object waiting ahead. The closer he came, the more the details revealed themselves, and his unease grew. This was no driftwood. It was larger, sleeker, its form betraying a purposeful design. Sunlight, weak and new, caught on a curve of metal that rose above the sand. Malcolm slowed, heart quickening, a sense of dread tightening in his chest. He had seen boats smashed to pieces by hurricanes, seen engines rust into skeletons of iron, but he had never seen anything like this. By the time he stood a few paces away, his throat had dried. The thing was a vessel of some kind, unmistakably man-made, but not like the fishing boats or even the small private crafts that sometimes ran too close to shore. Its surface was dark, matte, and smooth, as if designed to swallow light rather than reflect it. No paint, no numbers, no name carved into its side. Just a black, silent shell lodged in the sand. The tide washed around its base, swirling foam around the half-buried structure, as if the sea itself were reluctant to let go of it. Malcolm's breath left him in a slow exhale as he stepped nearer. A submarine. That was the only word that fit, though it was unlike the hulking steel monsters he had seen in photographs from the Navy. This was smaller, leaner, almost insect-like in its precision. Memories flickered in his mind of nights in town bars where old sailors whispered about phantom subs, about experiments that no Navy admitted to, about strange sightings in the waters where no ordinary vessel should be. He had laughed then, dismissing such stories as alcohol-fueled fantasies. But, standing here now with the cold morning light crawling across this foreign shape, laughter felt far away. He crouched, resting a rough hand on the cool metal, and a chill ran through his skin. It was colder than it should have been, as if the sea had preserved it in ice. His calloused palm lingered there, and in that moment he realized how alone he was, standing before something that should not have been. His fishing nets, his simple life, his small house a few streets inland, all of it felt abruptly fragile, dwarfed by this strange discovery. He straightened, scanning the structure, noting the absence of windows, the seamlessness of its design. Where were the hatches, the bolts, the marks of human craftsmanship? Everything about it seemed other, purposeful in a way he could not place. His heart thudded steadily, not in fear, but in that sharp edge of wonder that comes when the world suddenly reveals a secret it had been keeping. The gulls circled above, their cries sharp and impatient as if warning him to step back, to leave. The water lapped higher, caressing the dark hull, and the wind carried the faintest metallic tang, bitter on his tongue. Malcolm swallowed hard, his gaze lingering on the vessel. He knew he could not simply walk away. Something inside him demanded to know more. This was not debris, not trash, not a storm's cast-off. This was a message, though from whom and to whom he could not say. For a long moment he stood in silence, the dawn stretching wider behind him, the colors deepening, the day beginning around him. Yet here, before this blackened shape half buried in sand, time seemed suspended. His life had been measured in nets cast and fish hauled, in storms weathered and quiet sunsets shared with no one but himself. And now, in a single morning, all of that felt as though it had tilted, as though he had been nudged toward a path he had never sought. His fingers brushed the hull once more, and he took a step back, eyes narrowing. He would have to call someone. The authorities. He had no illusions that such a thing could remain hidden for long. But before he did, he allowed himself one last moment of solitude with it, one last moment to feel the weight of discovery resting on his shoulders. The sea had always given and taken, but never had it given him something like this. When he finally turned away, the vessel loomed at his back, a silent sentinel watching him leave. The sound of the waves filled his ears again, but they no longer seemed familiar. The ocean, his lifelong companion, had shifted into something unknowable, mysterious, almost menacing. Malcolm walked back toward his boat, the wet sand pulling at his boots, his mind racing with questions he could not yet form. Behind him, the black shape waited, as if it had been waiting all along, for him and him alone. The morning sun climbed higher, the town waking in the distance, but for Malcolm, the day no longer felt ordinary. He knew, deep in his bones, that his life had changed. The shore had brought him a secret, and secrets, once revealed, never slept quietly again. The sight of the vessel lingered in Malcolm's mind long after he had turned away from it, as though it had imprinted itself behind his eyes. The ordinary rhythm of his mornings was gone, replaced by a taut energy that followed him with every step as he made his way back to his boat. He had meant to push out into the water, cast his nets as he always did, but now the thought of fishing felt irrelevant, even absurd. His livelihood had always been the sea, yet in that moment he realized the sea had delivered something far stranger than any catch. His boat rocked gently at the edge of the tide, waiting, but his gaze kept straying back to the black silhouette lodged in the sand. He lingered near the boat as gulls wheeled overhead, the sound of their wings and cries merging with the hiss of the waves. The morning breeze carried the scent of brine and damp earth, but beneath it Malcolm thought he caught something else, faint yet distinct, the acrid sting of fuel, metallic and sharp, carried from the dark hull. He frowned, his hand unconsciously gripping the worn rope of his boat, his chest tightening as he debated whether to leave the thing behind or return to it. He already knew the answer. The ocean had given him a mystery, and turning his back on it now would gnaw at him until he broke. His boots sank deep into the sand as he trudged back. Each step seemed heavier than the last, as though some invisible weight pressed down on him, urging caution, demanding he think twice. Still, he pressed on, his eyes fixed on the strange shape that seemed to grow larger the closer he drew. The vessel's contours were foreign to him, too smooth and deliberate, as if carved from a single piece of shadow. It had no rivets, no seams, no paint to peel or rust to claim, only the wound at its rear, an ugly tear in the otherwise seamless shell, betrayed that it was vulnerable to the same elements as any machine. He circled cautiously, each movement deliberate, his breath held without him realizing it. The tear in the stern fascinated him most. It was not the jagged ruin of a violent explosion, but a long, split seam, as though something had sheared against it with tremendous force. He leaned closer, squinting, and caught the faintest shimmer of liquid glistening along the edges of the damage. The smell of fuel thickened here, heavy and cloying, mixed with the dank reek of seawater trapped within the hull. He reached out slowly, his rough fingers brushing the surface near the tear, and recoiled at the icy chill that spread through his skin. It was not the cold of a machine left too long in water. It was deeper, unnatural, like touching a stone that had never known the sun. Malcolm let his hand fall, flexing his fingers as if to shake off the sensation. The silence of the vessel unnerved him. He had grown up with the sounds of boats, the creak of timber, the groan of engines, the lapping of water against hulls. Even the most lifeless wrecks carried echoes of what they had been. But this thing gave nothing back. It was mute, unyielding, as if the sea itself had swallowed all memory of its journey. And yet, if he listened closely, he could swear he heard something, an almost imperceptible vibration deep within the black shell, like the faint hum of a machine refusing to die. He straightened, scanning its surface again. No markings, no numbers, no name etched into the metal. Nothing to suggest origin or ownership. Ships bore identities, even the illegal ones. Smugglers painted false flags, fishermen carved their initials, even abandoned wrecks carried the scars of their builders. But this vessel was anonymous, stripped of all human signature. It stood before him like a question mark carved in iron. The unease in his stomach deepened. He thought of the stories he had overheard in town, whispered by men who had sailed farther than he ever would. They spoke of submarines that prowled without flags, of silent craft that glided beneath the waves without leaving wakes, of vessels that never docked in harbors yet seemed to cross oceans. He had laughed at such tales then, dismissing them as the fantasies of men eager to inflate their adventures. But now, standing in the shadow of this thing, he wondered whether those stories had been closer to truth than anyone dared admit. Malcolm's mind wrestled with what to do next. He could not simply walk away, yet calling the authorities filled him with hesitation. He imagined patrol cars rolling down the narrow roads of the town, the Coast Guard setting up barriers, strangers in suits asking questions he could not answer. His discovery would be swallowed up by officials, leaving him with nothing but the knowledge that he had stumbled onto something forbidden. But what was the alternative? To hide it? Impossible. To keep it secret? The tide would not permit that. Sooner or later someone else would see it, and then what? The low growl of the surf interrupted his thoughts, as if the ocean itself reminded him that time was slipping. The tide would rise, the waves would creep higher, and the vessel might be dragged back out or buried further beneath the sand. He needed to decide. His hand moved to his pocket where the heavy shape of his old cell phone rested, the one he carried only for emergencies. This qualified. And yet, still, he hesitated. He crouched again near the tear in the hull, peering into the darkness within. He saw only shadows, but the smell was stronger here, mingled now with something sour, almost chemical. He pulled back quickly, the hair on his arms lifting as if in warning. There was no mistaking it. Whatever this vessel was, it had not been designed for ordinary work. It carried with it an aura of secrecy, of danger cloaked in steel. Rising slowly, he cast his gaze across the beach. The sun was climbing higher now, the light stronger, though still soft with the haze of early morning. The town remained distant and quiet. No one else seemed to have noticed yet. He felt alone with the discovery, as though the ocean had chosen him for it. The thought was absurd, but it clung to him, feeding his unease with a strange sense of responsibility. He drew in a breath, steadying himself, and finally pulled the phone from his pocket. His thumb hovered over the worn buttons as he considered the consequences. Once he made the call, this would no longer belong to him. It would be claimed, studied, locked away, yet he could not shake the feeling that leaving it unreported would invite disaster. He pictured children stumbling upon it while playing, or scavengers trying to pry it open with tools, releasing whatever secrets it hid. The risk was too great. As his thumb pressed down and the line began to ring, Malcolm cast one last glance at the black shape looming in the sand. Cold metal, silent and nameless, waiting. He did not know then that this single act, the decision to call, would unravel the quiet life he had known, drawing him into a web of secrets far darker than he imagined. The hum of the sea surrounded him as he held the phone to his ear, but behind it, in the silence of the vessel, he thought he still heard that faint vibration, steady as a heartbeat that refused to stop. The call connected. Malcolm cleared his throat, gave his name, and reported what he had found. His words felt unreal as he spoke them, as though he were describing something from a dream. The voice on the other end asked questions, slow and deliberate, and told him to remain where he was until help arrived. He ended the call with a heavy exhale, staring at the vessel, his chest tight. The beach seemed to grow quieter then, as though the world itself were holding its breath. He stood still, the gulls circling above him, the tide creeping closer to his boots. For all his years as a fisherman, for all the storms he had braved and the nights he had spent adrift with nothing but the stars for company, he had never felt so small, so uncertain. The sea had always been honest in its cruelty, its generosity, but this was something else. He remained there, unwilling to move, his eyes fixed on the dark hull. The silence pressed against him like a weight, broken only by the faintest hum that seemed to rise and fall in rhythm with the ocean. A cold bead of sweat slid down his temple. The waiting had begun, and with it the sense that the world around him had shifted. He knew that whatever happened next would not be his choice to make. The minutes after Malcolm ended the call stretched out with a heaviness that pressed on his chest. He remained near the strange vessel, rooted by both fear and fascination, his phone still clutched in one hand. The surf hissed and retreated around the dark hull, and each time the water slid back it seemed to carry with it more of the sand that had held the craft in place, revealing little by little more of its unnatural form. He wanted to look away, to retreat to the safety of his boat and the familiar comfort of nets and ropes, but his eyes kept dragging back, unable to escape its pull. The hum he thought he heard within the metal shell might have been his imagination, but it haunted his thoughts nonetheless, and it felt almost like he was standing beside some slumbering beast that might at any moment stir. When the first sound of engines broke across the quiet beach, Malcolm flinched. The distant whine of tires over the coastal road reached him long before he saw the vehicles themselves. He turned, shielding his eyes against the morning light, and spotted the approaching convoy. 2 white police cruisers, their lights off but their presence unmistakable, followed by the square silhouette of a Coast Guard truck, its emblem barely catching the sun. Behind them, further down the road, came a darker van, windowless and unmarked, moving with the purposeful steadiness of something that did not need to announce itself. Malcolm's mouth went dry. The vehicles slowed as they reached the sand's edge, doors opening in near unison. Uniformed officers stepped out, their boots crunching over the grit, their hands resting near their belts in a way that spoke more of protocol than comfort. The Coast Guard men wore their caps low, scanning the horizon as if expecting an ambush from the waves themselves. And then came the others, 2 men and a woman, dressed in gray suits despite the rising heat, their faces pale and set, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. They moved with quiet authority, and the air around them seemed to shift as if they carried with them the weight of decisions made far from this small Florida beach. Malcolm felt suddenly exposed, as though he had trespassed into a world that was not his. He raised a hand in an awkward half-wave, the gesture of a man who did not know what else to do, and one of the policemen approached him, notebook already in hand. The officer's questions were clipped and precise. His name, his occupation, what time he had first seen the vessel, whether he had touched it, whether he had noticed anyone else near it. Malcolm answered each carefully, aware of the suits watching him from a distance, their faces unreadable. The policeman's pencil scratched across the page, every word preserved, every pause noted. When the questions ended, Malcolm was guided a few steps back toward his boat. "Stay nearby," the officer told him, voice polite but firm, the kind that brooked no argument. He nodded, folding his arms across his chest, though the gesture did nothing to ease the tightness there. From his new vantage, he could see the whole scene unfold. The Coast Guard men circling the vessel, testing the sand with their boots, whispering in low tones, the suits standing slightly apart, murmuring into small radios clipped to their collars, the policemen forming a wide perimeter, waving away the few curious townsfolk who had begun to drift closer from the road. The vessel itself remained unmoved, an impassive shadow half buried in the shore. Yet the way the officials treated it was telling. They did not touch it casually, did not climb aboard or press their palms against the metal as Malcolm had. Instead, they approached as though it were a live wire, each movement measured, careful, wary. The Coast Guard officers attempted to locate an entry point, running their hands along the seamless surface, tapping gently with gloved knuckles, but the craft yielded no secrets. It was only when they reached the torn section at the stern that their voices sharpened, urgency creeping in. From where he stood, Malcolm could see them gathering near the damage, pointing, gesturing. Tools were fetched from the truck, heavy cases dragged through the sand, their clasps snapping open to reveal saws and torches that caught the sun with a glint of menace. The smell of fuel thickened as they worked, the hiss of acetylene flames mixing with the hiss of the tide. Sparks leapt against the dark hull but seemed almost swallowed by it, as though the material resisted not only their tools but the very light itself. Hours seemed to slip by, though Malcolm knew it could not have been more than minutes, his sense of time distorted by the strangeness of the moment. The suits remained apart, speaking only among themselves, but Malcolm could feel their attention on him nonetheless. Each time he shifted, their heads turned slightly, their hidden eyes tracking him. He fought the urge to walk away, to climb into his boat and push off into the forgiven embrace of the sea, but something told him that leaving was no longer an option. He was a witness now, bound to this mystery whether he wanted it or not. Finally, with a screech of torn metal that carried across the sand like the cry of some wounded animal, the first breach appeared. The Coast Guard men stepped back as a section of the torn hull gave way, revealing darkness within. The air that spilled out was cold and bitter, laced with the smell of chemicals that burned the throat even at a distance. One of the men gagged behind his mask, another pulled a heavier respirator from the case and passed it along. The suits leaned forward slightly then, as though confirming something they had expected, their murmurs sharper now, urgent. Malcolm's stomach twisted. He could not see inside from where he stood, but he knew that whatever lay beyond that breach was not ordinary cargo. Boats carried fish, crates, barrels, sometimes drugs or weapons in the darker corners of the world. But this silence, this careful dance of men who should have been more confident, told him it was something else entirely. His mind raced with possibilities, each darker than the last. The police officer who had taken his statement returned briefly, placing a hand on Malcolm's arm. "You'll need to remain a bit longer," he said, voice low but not unkind. Malcolm nodded mutely, his throat too tight for words. The officer gave him a searching look, as though trying to read what the fisherman truly thought, then moved away again to help secure the perimeter. Left alone once more, Malcolm turned his gaze back to the vessel. The breach yawned wider now, and the men moved with greater urgency, pulling equipment closer, readying lights to shine into the void. The gulls had fallen strangely quiet overhead, as though even they sensed the tension. The sea, too, seemed to hold its breath, the waves gentler, the wind subdued, nature itself pausing to witness what was about to be revealed. Malcolm shivered despite the growing warmth of the sun. He told himself he was only a fisherman, a man whose world should never have brushed against things like this. And yet, here he stood, his simple life already tangled with secrets that did not belong to him. He could feel the weight of it pressing against him, heavy as the tide. As the suits stepped closer to the breach, their voices now issuing commands that carried even to his ears, Malcolm realized that the moment he had made that call, he had crossed a line. The mystery was no longer his alone, but neither was it something he could escape. The strange vessel had drawn him into its shadow, and there would be no returning to the quiet mornings he once knew. The torches hissed again, sparks flying as the breach widened further. Soon the dark would be open to the light, and with it the truth hidden inside. Malcolm's pulse quickened, his eyes fixed unblinking on the shadowed opening. He knew, as surely as he knew the rhythms of tide and current, that whatever they found within would change everything. And still, beneath the noise of tools and the shuffle of boots, He thought he heard it again, that faint vibration deep within the hull, steady, unnatural, like a heartbeat echoing from the depths. The grinding of metal filled the air, a sound that made Malcolm's teeth clench and his palms sweat. He could feel the vibration of the tools even from where he stood, a rough pulsing in the sand beneath his boots as sparks rained down in fitful bursts against the vessel's unyielding shell. The men working at the breach labored in tense silence, each movement methodical, their faces half hidden behind masks that made them look less like rescuers and more like surgeons preparing for a dangerous operation. Malcolm's heart beat in time with the hissing of the torches, and though he told himself to look away, his eyes refused to leave the strange craft. The section of hull finally gave, curling back in twisted metal edges like the peeled skin of some massive fruit. A gust of air burst outward, carrying with it a chill so sharp it raised gooseflesh along Malcolm's arms despite the warmth of the sun now climbing high above the beach. He shivered, pulling instinctively at the collar of his shirt, but it did nothing to shield him from the sudden impression that he was standing on the threshold of something vast and unknowable. The smell that accompanied it was worse, acrid, chemical, a biting stench that seemed to claw its way into his lungs. He gagged and covered his mouth, his stomach roiling as he forced himself not to turn away. Lights flickered on as the Coast Guard men aimed powerful beams into the opening. What those lights revealed made their shoulders stiffen, their voices low and urgent as they called for the suits to step closer. Malcolm strained to catch a glimpse, but from his distance he saw only brief flashes. Slick surfaces reflecting the glow, a narrow corridor lined not with the pipes and panels he expected, but with something far stranger, cleaner, as though he were peering into a laboratory rather than the belly of a ship. The suits moved then, their deliberate calm sharpened into focus. They conferred in clipped tones, one of them lifting a hand to silence a Coast Guard man's question, before ordering that no one step inside until they had confirmed safety. He could hear their words carried by the wind, phrases like containment, controlled entry, secondary breach, and though he did not understand their full meaning, the weight behind them was unmistakable. This was no smuggler's craft, no desperate contraption built to ferry contraband. This was something altogether different, something that even these hardened officials feared. Malcolm's breath caught as he finally saw inside. One of the officers angled his light just right, and the beam cut deeper into the vessel's shadowed interior. What lay within was not a row of seats or the cramped cockpit he had expected, but a chamber lined with cylindrical capsules. They stood upright, gleaming faintly beneath condensation, their surfaces fogged from the cold air rushing out. Within some of them he thought he glimpsed shapes, containers filled with fluid, metallic tubing coiled like serpents around their sides. He squinted, heart pounding, but the officers moved in front of the breach, blocking his view, their own postures stiffening as if they too struggled to comprehend what they saw. The murmurs around the breach grew more intense. Instructions passed quickly, hands gesturing for more equipment. A generator was hauled across the sand, its mechanical cough breaking the uneasy stillness, and wires snaked from it toward the vessel, feeding lights and instruments that hummed with quiet menace. The suits donned thicker gloves and stepped closer, their silhouettes stark against the brightening day as they leaned into the opening, their heads tilted as though taking in every detail. Malcolm's curiosity burned, but so too did his fear. He shifted on his feet, his body caught between the urge to edge closer and the instinct to flee. For all his years on the water, through storms and long nights alone on the rolling waves, He had never felt so unmoored. The ocean had always been honest in its brutality. When it wished to take, it took. When it wished to give, it gave. But this was something else. This was human, or perhaps not entirely human, and it carried with it an emptiness that felt worse than danger. It felt like trespass. He tried to listen to their words, but the jargon slipped past him. What he understood, though, chilled him more than the chemical air. They spoke of samples, of secondary containers, of materials compromised. His stomach turned when he realized that the black packages being pulled from the shadows were not shaped like drugs or weapons, but like equipment. Thick wrappings peeled back to reveal metallic casings, dials, glass tubes filled with cloudy liquid. One of the Coast Guard men dropped a piece, cursing as it rolled into the sand, and immediately one of the suits barked at him, voice tight with panic, to handle with extreme care. Malcolm saw the man's hands trembling as he picked it up again, his eyes darting nervously toward the capsules still inside the chamber. The officers worked faster now, moving in a rhythm of practiced caution, each item extracted and carried toward waiting crates on the sand. Malcolm glimpsed papers among the debris, loose sheets scrawled with symbols and diagrams he did not recognize. Some bore foreign languages, fragments of words that slipped through his mind without meaning, while others seemed almost mathematical, the ink smeared as though written in haste. A suit snatched them up quickly, tucking them into a waterproof bag with a sharp motion, casting a glance over his shoulder as if to make sure no one had noticed. But Malcolm had noticed, and the sight lodged in his mind like a thorn. He thought again of the vibration he had heard earlier, that faint hum within the hull. If this vessel had been unmanned, if it carried no crew, then who or what had steered it here? And if it had not been meant for eyes like his, what purpose had it served before the sea cast it back? The crowd around the breach swelled with activity, but Malcolm remained fixed in place, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He told himself he was just a fisherman, that none of this belonged to him, yet he could not ignore the pull of it, the gnawing sense that he had been drawn here not by chance but by some darker current. The suits barked more orders, and the police tightened the perimeter, pushing back even the few townsfolk who lingered on the road. Malcolm caught their stares, wide-eyed and curious, but he knew they would hear nothing of what truly lay within that vessel. To them, it would be a rumor, a whispered story over beer and fried fish, destined to fade. But to him, it was more. He had touched the cold hull, smelled the chemical air, glimpsed the capsules waiting in the shadows. He had seen the fear in the officials' postures, the urgency in their eyes. He knew enough to understand that what they found inside was not meant for ordinary men to see. The sun was high now, the beach bright, but Malcolm felt only the chill that lingered from the open hatch. He watched as more black packages were carried out, as the suits leaned deeper into the corridor, their voices dropping to hushed tones. He thought he heard the word containment again, sharper this time, edged with concern. And then came something stranger still. One of the men shouted for a light, and when the beam swung across the chamber, Malcolm glimpsed a final capsule, larger than the others, its glass fractured, fluid dripping slowly onto the floor of the vessel. The suits froze, their bodies taut, before quickly forming a wall to block the view. Malcolm leaned instinctively to see more, but the officers shifted, their presence cutting off his line of sight. He could not know what lay within that broken shell, but the way they moved told him it was something they had not expected, something that frightened even them. The air grew thicker, the stench stronger, and Malcolm's chest tightened. He turned his eyes toward the sea, its endless horizon unchanged, indifferent to the secrets it had delivered. For a fleeting moment, he longed for his nets, for the simplicity of fish scales and rope burns, for the honest work of pulling sustenance from the waves. But that life had slipped from him the moment he touched the cold metal of the hull. He knew it, even if he could not yet say why. Behind him, the voices of the officials carried on, brisk and controlled, their actions efficient as they catalogued and sealed away the vessel's secrets. But Malcolm understood something deeper than their words. The ocean had returned something it had not been meant to release, and in doing so it had tangled him in a story larger than himself. The hatch had been opened, and with it, so had a door he could never close again. The rest of that day passed for Malcolm in a blur, as if he were drifting outside of himself. He had remained on the beach until the sun began to slide toward the horizon, watching the authorities comb through the vessel, watching them drag out sealed containers, thick folders, crates of equipment wrapped in tarps that never touched the ground for more than a moment before being whisked into unmarked vans. The more they carried away, the tighter the knot in his stomach grew. The fisherman he had known all his life dealt with straightforward truths. Nets were either full or empty, storms either came or passed, engines either ran or failed. But this thing, this strange vessel torn open to the light of day, seemed to grow less comprehensible the more of it was revealed. When at last they told him he could leave, he walked home along the sand like a man carrying too much on his back. The gulls cried overhead, the waves churned as they always had, yet the world felt altered, stripped of its familiarity. He reached his small house near the harbor and sat heavily on the porch, staring at the water until the sky darkened to indigo and the first stars pricked the horizon. But though he tried to let the night calm him, unease gnawed at his mind like a restless tide. That unease sharpened into fear when he noticed the car. It sat too still at the end of his street, its headlights extinguished but its silhouette outlined faintly in the glow of the nearest street lamp. For a long moment he convinced himself it belonged to one of his neighbors, perhaps a cousin visiting or a late-night errand. But when the engine flickered to life and the vehicle crept forward, passing his house without slowing, he felt the hairs rise on his arms. He knew then what the suit's stares on the beach had meant. They weren't done with him. Sleep did not come easily. He lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling as shadows shifted across the plaster. Each time a car passed on the street outside, his breath caught, half expecting the sound of heavy boots on his porch, the knock of officials come to silence his questions before they could form. He rose several times through the night to peer through the blinds, but the road remained empty, the harbor quiet save for the gentle clink of rigging against masts. Still, he could not shake the feeling that eyes lingered on him even when he stood alone in the darkness. By morning, his exhaustion was bone deep, but he forced himself into motion. Habit drove him to the docks, nets slung over his shoulder, the smell of bait clinging to his hands. But even here, in the place that had always been his refuge, the weight of what he had seen clung to him. Other fishermen greeted him with nods and muttered jokes about the strange convoy they had glimpsed on the road the day before. Rumors were already spreading. Some claimed the vessel had been a cartel sub stuffed with cocaine, others that it carried nuclear waste meant to be dumped at sea. Malcolm listened in silence, offering no correction, though his chest burned with the knowledge that neither rumor came close to the truth. He cast his nets, pulled them in, cast them again, but his body moved without his mind. All the while, he replayed the images from the beach, the capsules lined in shadow, the broken one leaking its strange fluid, the way the suits had lunged to block the view. He thought of the word he had heard again and again, containment, and wondered what it truly meant. If there had been no people inside, then what had the sub been built to carry? Equipment? Experiments? Something alive? The thought made his stomach churn. By midday, he abandoned his work and steered his boat back to shore. The catch was meager, but he hardly noticed. Instead of heading home, he walked into town, his boots echoing against the cracked sidewalks, the smell of frying seafood drifting from the diner where old men sat swapping tales. He passed them by and entered the library, a place he had rarely visited since boyhood. Its air was cool and musty, filled with the faint rustle of newspapers being turned and the occasional cough from behind a stack. He sought out the microfilm archives first, fumbling with the machine as though handling a net unfamiliar in his hands. For hours he pored over headlines, searching for anything that might echo what he had seen. What he found unsettled him further. Old clippings told of rumors along the coasts of South America, fishermen who spoke of strange craft surfacing briefly before vanishing, of metallic shapes glimpsed just beneath the waves. A few reports mentioned seizures of semi-submersibles built by cartels, crude craft used to ferry drugs north, but none of the grainy photos matched the sleek, seamless vessel he had touched with his own hand. One article, buried deep in the archives, spoke of experimental drones lost at sea, their existence denied by the governments accused of building them. The phrasing struck him like a hook catching flesh. Lost at sea. Had the thing he found been one of those? As dusk crept across the library windows, Malcolm left with more questions than answers. He felt the weight of glances on him as he walked home, and once again he spotted a car idling too long at a corner before turning away. They were watching him. Of that he was sure. The knowledge settled heavy in his gut. He had been marked, not just as the man who found the vessel, but as someone who knew too much simply by looking upon it. That night, the unease deepened into something darker. Twice he woke to the creak of floorboards, rising with his heart in his throat to find nothing but shadows. Yet, in the morning, when he opened his front door, he noticed the faint scuff of boots across his porch, sand clinging where it should not have been. Someone had been there. He closed the door slowly, pressing his back against it as if it alone could shield him, and still he could not stop digging. He spoke in hushed tones to an old mechanic down at the harbor, a man who had once served in the Coast Guard. The mechanic's face paled when Malcolm described what he had seen, though he pretended not to believe him. Later, when the two stood alone near the water, the old man muttered a warning. There were projects no one admitted existed, unmanned vessels that carried more than cargo, things that could cross an ocean without surfacing. "You didn't see what you think you saw," he whispered, "and for your own sake you ought to forget it." But Malcolm could not forget. The image of the broken capsule haunted him, the strange fluid dripping onto the floor, the urgency in the officials' voices. At night, he heard again the vibration within the hull, like a heart that refused to stop beating. He had become tangled in something far beyond his reach, and yet the truth pulled at him with relentless force. Each day he grew more certain that his life was no longer his own. Men in suits loitered too long near the market, their eyes hidden by glasses. A figure appeared at the end of his street each evening before vanishing when approached. Even out at sea, where he had once found freedom, he felt watched, the horizon less empty than it seemed. The ocean, his oldest companion, had turned traitor, delivering not sustenance but a secret that poisoned the quiet fabric of his days. And yet, beneath the fear, a spark of defiance grew. He had been chosen by chance, yes, but also by fate. He was the one who had found the vessel, the one who had touched its cold skin, the one who had smelled the air it exhaled. That truth belonged to him, no matter how many officials tried to erase it. The more they watched him, the more he felt the need to understand, to peel back the layers they guarded so fiercely. He knew then that he would not let it go. The sea had given him a secret, and secrets once found demanded to be chased, even if it cost him the peace of his small life, even if it cost him far more. The days that followed sank into Malcolm's memory like stones into deep water, heavy and permanent. The vessel had been removed from the beach, carted away in the dark of night on a massive flatbed truck while soldiers and men in suits kept townsfolk far back behind barricades. By morning, the sand was raked clean, as though nothing had ever lain there. Yet, Malcolm knew the truth. No matter how smooth the beach appeared, no matter how many tire tracks had been covered or footprints erased, something had been torn from the depths and revealed, and it had altered him forever. He walked the docks as though in a haze, casting nets with motions that had once been second nature, but now felt clumsy, performed by a body that no longer belonged entirely to him. The sea gave him fish still, but he could no longer take joy in their weight or shine, for every scale glittered like a question, and every wave that rocked his boat seemed to whisper of the vessel taken away. The town itself buzzed with rumor. In the diner, where the scent of fried shrimp and old coffee clung to the walls, men leaned over their plates to mutter theories. Some swore it had been a narco sub, filled with cocaine bricks wrapped watertight in black plastic, abandoned when its crew lost their nerve. Others claimed it had been a weapons dump, a failed smuggling attempt by foreign hands meant to plant explosives in American waters. Still others, lowering their voices even further, whispered of something stranger, a military project gone wrong. Malcolm sat in corners, listening without joining, his silence the silence of a man who had seen more than he could speak of. One evening, when the sun had burned the sky into shades of gold and crimson, he lingered at the harbor to speak with a younger fisherman who had a cousin in the Coast Guard. The man leaned close, his breath sharp with beer, and told him in a hushed voice that the rumors weren't far off. Packages had been removed, yes, but not drugs. Something else. Containers sealed so tight even the men handling them hadn't known what they carried. Samples, the cousin had called them. Biological samples. Malcolm's chest had tightened at the words. The memory of the broken capsule returned to him with startling clarity. The cracked glass, the fluid dripping onto the chamber floor, the frantic way the suits had rushed to block the view. He felt a shiver creep down his spine as the fisherman clapped him on the shoulder, mistaking his silence for disbelief. In the nights that followed, Malcolm could not rest. Sleep abandoned him as visions of those capsules swam in his mind. He imagined them lined up in the dark belly of the sub, each one containing something unknown, something dangerous enough to demand secrecy at all costs. He thought of the papers snatched from the sand, covered in equations and languages he could not recognize, and the way the officials had hissed the word containment like a curse. Whatever had been inside that vessel, it was not meant to be found. It had been hidden beneath the sea for a reason, and yet fate, or malfunction, had cast it ashore. Around town, the tension thickened. People had seen the trucks at night, the lights along the beach, the men with rifles keeping watch. They spoke of it in murmurs, but when one of the suits appeared in town, the conversations died at once, voices swallowed by fear. Malcolm noticed it more and more. Strangers in dark cars idling by the market, men he did not know drinking coffee without speaking in the diner, eyes that followed him a second too long before sliding away. He began to feel hunted, though no one approached him openly. Their silence was worse than confrontation, for it told him that he was not to be spoken to, but only observed, measured, and contained like one more dangerous sample. One afternoon, as he walked the shoreline where he had first discovered the vessel, he spotted faint impressions in the sand, too uniform to be random, too heavy to belong to ordinary beachgoers. Boot prints, he realized, leading from the water's edge up toward the dunes, half erased by wind but not gone. He crouched and touched one with his calloused hand, his chest tightening. Had someone come after the vessel was taken, or had something left it before the officials had arrived? He pushed the thought away, but it followed him home, clinging to his mind like a fishhook lodged too deep to be removed. The nights grew louder with the whir of helicopters that never passed directly overhead, but lingered near the coast, their distant rotors like an insect's drone at the edge of hearing. The ocean itself seemed unsettled, waves harsher, tides shifting in ways Malcolm felt through his bones. He told himself it was nothing, just the restlessness of his own thoughts, but still he found himself standing at his window long past midnight, staring at the black horizon, waiting for some shape to rise again from the sea. It was in the small hours of such a night that a knock came at his door. Soft at first, almost polite, but insistent. Malcolm froze in his chair, his hands tightening on the armrests until his knuckles ached. The knock came again, sharper now, followed by silence. He rose slowly, each step deliberate, his bare feet whispering against the wooden floorboards. When he reached the door and pressed his ear to it, he heard only the wind. He opened it a crack and found nothing, only the dark street, empty under the faint glow of the lamp, and a scrap of paper tucked under the mat. He bent, heart hammering, and unfolded it with trembling hands. 3 words, scrawled in rough ink: "Stop asking questions." Malcolm stared at the note until the letters blurred. His throat felt tight, his stomach hollow. They knew he had been searching. They knew he had spoken to the mechanic, to the fisherman's cousin, had spent hours in the library chasing scraps of rumor. They knew, and they wanted him silent. He closed the door, bolting it, and sat through the rest of the night with the note clenched in his hand, his eyes wide and unblinking as the shadows shifted around him. But even fear could not kill the spark of defiance within him. If anything, it stoked it hotter. He had not sought this truth, but it had come to him, and he felt a strange obligation to carry it, even if it led him into danger. In the following days he returned to the docks, speaking carefully, listening more than he spoke, gathering fragments of conversation that slipped through the cracks of secrecy. He pieced together a story that chilled him. The vessel had been remotely controlled, steered from a ship far out at sea. But something had gone wrong, the guidance failing, the sub running aground instead of reaching its destination. Inside, it had carried not contraband but experiments, samples meant for transport without ever touching human hands. One of those containers had broken, and that was why the officials had moved so swiftly, why the suits had barked orders with such urgency. Something had escaped, or might have. The realization gnawed at him. If even a fragment of that cargo had leaked into the sea, what might it have unleashed? He thought of the fish he pulled from his nets each morning, of the seabirds that wheeled overhead, of the children who played along the shore. Was the ocean now poisoned with something unseen, something the officials would never admit to? His mind spiraled with questions that no one would answer, and he knew then that silence was their weapon. As long as he kept doubting himself, as long as the town dismissed it as rumor, the truth would rot beneath layers of secrecy. One evening, sitting at the end of the pier with the note still in his pocket, Malcolm whispered to the sea as he had once done as a boy. The water rolled black beneath the moonlight, endless and indifferent. He told it he would not stop, that he would carry the memory of what he had seen, even if no one believed him. The gulls cried in the distance, the tide sighed against the pilings, and in his chest the spark of defiance hardened into resolve. He could not undo what had been found, but he could refuse to let it vanish. When he rose and turned for home, he glanced once more at the horizon. For an instant, he thought he saw a shadow slip beneath the waves, too smooth to be a fish, too deliberate to be drift. His breath caught, but when he blinked it was gone. Still, the sight lingered in his mind, an echo of the vessel that had begun it all, a reminder that the sea never surrendered all its secrets at once. The town would keep whispering. The suits would keep watching. The officials would keep denying. But Malcolm knew what he had seen, and he knew the truth was larger than any warning scribbled on a scrap of paper. He walked home with his shoulders squared, the salt wind whipping against his face, ready for whatever came next. The vessel had been taken, but its shadow remained. And so too did the knowledge that he was now part of something vast, something dangerous, something that had only begun to reveal itself. Malcolm moved through the final days of that summer as a man who no longer belonged to the life he had lived before. The sea still greeted him each morning, the tide still dragged his boat across the shallows, and the gulls still wheeled and screamed above him, yet he felt like an intruder in his own routine. Each knot tied, each net hauled, each fish gutted seemed to belong to another version of himself, a man who could once be content with the simple rhythm of survival. That man had died the morning he laid his hand on the cold skin of the vessel. What remained was someone marked, someone watched, someone carrying a truth that no one else wanted to hear. Rumors in the town had not faded but twisted, becoming stranger with each retelling. Some swore the vessel had carried chemical weapons meant for terrorists. Others whispered of a plague sealed away in steel, intended to be delivered to some distant shore. A few, emboldened by drink, leaned in close to speak of things alive, things that were not meant to exist. Malcolm listened as he had before, but with each rumor his silence grew heavier. They could talk all they liked, but none of them had seen what he had seen. None had smelled that cold, chemical stench or glimpsed the fractured capsule leaking its unknown fluid. None had felt the vibration that pulsed within the hull like a heart too stubborn to die. He carried those memories like stones in his pockets, and they dragged at him wherever he went. He could not shake the feeling that the cargo had not been completely removed, that something had been left behind or lost in the confusion of the beach. Each time he cast his nets, he studied the fish with suspicion, looking for signs of change, watching for mutations or sickness. Each time he walked the shoreline, he scanned the sand for scraps of debris missed by the officials. More than once he thought he saw something glimmering beneath the waves at dusk, smooth and black like the shadow of the vessel itself. When he blinked it was gone, but the unease remained. The note he had found on his porch sat folded in his pocket, creased and worn from the countless times his fingers traced its edges. Stop asking questions. The warning echoed louder with each day, and yet it did not silence him. If anything, it steeled his resolve. He spoke less to others, for he trusted no one now, but within himself he nurtured a quiet defiance. He would not forget. even if the world demanded that he pretend nothing had happened. It was not long before the final act unfolded. One night, long after the town had gone still, Malcolm was drawn back to the beach where it had all begun. The tide was low, the stars sharp against the velvet sky, and the moon painted the waves in silver. He stood at the edge of the surf, his boots sinking into the wet sand, staring out at the vast black horizon. The air carried with it the hum of engines, faint but unmistakable. He turned his head and saw lights cresting the dunes, sweeping across the sand like search beams. Trucks rolled into view, their engines low, their silhouettes monstrous against the starlight. Soldiers spilled from the backs of the vehicles, their boots drumming in unison, their rifles glinting faintly. Behind them came the suits, their faces pale ghosts in the moonlight, their voices sharp as they barked orders. Malcolm stood frozen, his heart hammering as he realized they had returned for something left unfinished. At first, he thought they had come for him, but then he saw it. A massive flatbed trailer pulled into position, its surface lined with restraints and cables. They had come for the vessel. It rose from the darkness beyond the breakers, hauled by winches and cables, its black hull gleaming wetly as though it had been dredged from the bottom of the sea itself. Malcolm's breath caught. He had thought it gone forever, spirited away in the first convoy, but here it was again, larger and more terrible than he remembered. The ocean released it reluctantly, waves foaming angrily around its flanks, as though it resisted being taken. Men shouted, chains groaned, machines strained against the weight. Bit by bit, the vessel was dragged ashore, its guttural scrape across the sand loud as thunder. Malcolm stepped back into the shadows, unseen, his pulse loud in his ears. He watched as they worked with frantic precision, securing the craft to the trailer, welding restraints, sealing the broken breech with heavy plates. Torches flared, sparks danced, and still that faint vibration seemed to thrum from within, as though the thing lived despite their efforts to cage it. The suits moved swiftly, burning papers and metal drums, sealing crates into trucks, erasing every trace of what the vessel had carried. The air smelled of fire and salt, of secrecy and fear. And in that moment, Malcolm understood the truth. This was not an ending. It was only another step in a long chain of concealments, a cycle that would continue as long as men sought to build what should not be built and hide what should not be seen. The vessel would be taken elsewhere, hidden in some warehouse or laboratory, dissected and studied in silence. The world would never know, not from the mouths of those in power, but he would know, and he would remember. He stayed hidden until the convoy began to move, the trucks grinding away from the beach with their burden secured. When the last light faded beyond the dunes, he emerged once more onto the sand. Only the scorched patches and the churned tracks remained, but the silence told him all he needed to hear. The vessel was gone again, but its shadow lingered. He lifted his gaze to the horizon, where the moon's silver path stretched endlessly over the dark water. The sea whispered at his feet, its foam cool against his boots, its voice eternal. He thought of the old tales fishermen told, of the things the sea kept hidden in its depths, of wrecks and bones and secrets never meant to surface. He thought of the capsule cracked open like an egg, of the fluid seeping out, of the air that had hissed with something not meant for lungs. He thought of the vibration, steady and patient, like a heartbeat in the dark. And he knew, with a certainty deeper than fear, that the sea had more to reveal. This was not the last secret it would surrender. The wind tugged at his clothes, the tide pressed forward, and Malcolm felt something within him settle. He could not fight what was larger than nations, could not stop what moved unseen in the deeps, but he could bear witness. He could remember when others forgot, could carry the truth like a net heavy with catch, dragging it through the currents of silence. The officials might erase, the townsfolk might dismiss, the world might turn away, but he would hold fast. He turned and walked slowly back along the beach, the sand cool beneath his feet, the night vast above him. Behind him the waves erased the tracks of soldiers and machines, smoothing the shore as if nothing had ever happened. Yet in his heart he carried the weight of it, a secret too large to set down. At the edge of the dunes he paused one final time and looked back. The sea gleamed silver under the moon, endless and impenetrable. A veil stretched across something ancient and unknowable. His chest rose and fell with a steady breath, and he whispered to the water, though no one was near to hear. The words were simple, but they bound him like an oath. "I will not forget." And with that, he stepped away from the shore, knowing he would return again and again, for the sea would always call him. And with each tide it might bring forth another truth. The vessel was gone, but the ocean was eternal, and it held more than shores. It held secrets, waiting for the day they would rise again. Don't miss what's coming next. Hit subscribe now and turn on the bell so you never miss another shocking story. Watch the next video on your screen for even more unbelievable discoveries, and share this video with your friends so they can see the truth for themselves.